Good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Trobe Asia event, Democracy in Malaysia, Prospects and Possibilities. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Executive Director of Trobe Asia at Trobe University. I would like to begin this event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which Trobe University sits. I would also like to pay respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who are present tonight. Trobe Asia is very proud of our efforts to engage the public in thoughtful discussion and debate and to deepen our knowledge and our understanding of the region in which we live. Malaysian politics appears to be experiencing a period of upheaval and uncertainty. In May 2018, Malaysians put an end to 61 years of a United Malay National Organisation monopoly on power by electing a new coalition. But 3.5 years later, the UMNO is back. While Malaysia faces recovery from a devastating pandemic and the economic fallout from a lengthy lockdown, there also appears to be significant political challenges as the new Prime Minister, Ismail Sabri Yaakob, must manage a tenuous coalition whose support is crucial to government stability within a broader context of shifting allegiances. What do these political developments mean for Malaysia's long-term democratic prospects? I'm really delighted to be joined by an exceptional panel of experts to help unpack that question. Dr. Amrita Mali is a visiting fellow at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. Amrita is an historian of Southeast Asia with a primary interest in Islam, shifting identities and identity conflict in colonial Malaya and contemporary Malaysia. Welcome, Amrita. Professor James Chin is the Chair of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. He writes extensively on contemporary Malaysian politics. It's really terrific to have you here, James. And last but certainly not least, we have Associate Professor Kirsten Steiner, who is an academic and Director of Research in the Trobe University's Law School. Kirsten specialises in Southeast Asian legal studies, researching at the intersection of law, politics, economics and society. Great to have you along, as always, Kirsten. There will be an opportunity for audience Q&A in the last part of tonight's session. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as we go along through the event, and I will pose them to our panel in the last part of the session. But I want to get straight into the discussion with you, James. Malaysia's new Prime Minister, Ismail, has a tenuous hold on leadership, as I said in the introduction. There's been 3 Prime Ministers since 2018. I'm wondering if you can begin our conversation by giving a brief overview of the state of Malaysian politics over the last couple of years, as it can be quite complicated.
Thank you very much, Beck, and thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion on Malaysian politics. So I think the Malaysian story, as you mentioned, is a bit complicated. So I think we'll start with the regime change in 2018. So I think when that happened, I think there was a lot of joy, a lot of optimism in Malaysia. People really thought that Malaysia has finally reached the stage where democratic transition was possible. And a lot of people at that time gave the benefit of the doubt to Pakatan Harapan, the opposition alliance, even though it was led by Mahathir Mohamad. As many of the viewers know, Mahathir Mohamad was Malaysia's longest serving prime minister, but this time he came back leading an opposition alliance. Now, unfortunately, Pakatan Harapan's experiment with multiracial politics lasted just 2 years, because in 2020, his Pakatan Harapan basically fell apart. And it fell apart basically for 3 reasons. The first one is that there was a lot of political tensions in the government because Mahathir refused to hand power over to his successor, Anwar Ibrahim. Depends on who you speak to. Apparently, there was a political deal done where Anwar is supposed to take over from Mahathir 2 years after 2018, in other words, in 2020. The second reason was that because the opposition alliance came together sort of at the very last minute, when they got into government, basically each of the parties, the major parties, Pakatan Harapan, were basically doing their own things. So, for example, Mahathir's party, Bersatu or PPBM, was basically, running the government like UMNO, the previous party in power. DAP was trying to promote a more or less racial approach, more inclusive, less racial approach to government. And the third governing party, Amanah, was trying to position itself to replace PAS. So basically, each of those parties were doing their own thing. So there was a lot of dysfunction. The third reason why it fell apart was essentially the opposition, UMNO, for the first time in UMNO's history, they decided to work with the Islamic Party PAS. If you look at the history of Malaysia, it was always widely understood in the Malay community that you only had two real choices. If you're sort of a Malay nationalist, a small Islamist, you sort of join UMNO. If you believe that Malaysia should head towards the Islamic path and becoming more Islamic, you join PAS. So it was quite incredible after 2018. These two core Malay parties got together, and they had a very, very powerful narrative against the Pakatan Harapan government, which was that the Malay and Islam were being marginalized. So with all this pressure in the background, basically the government fell apart. Initially, Mahathir thought that he could control the situation by coming back and creating a new government, what he calls a government national unity. But this was a government national unity with minimum participation of the non-Malays. But of course, we know that he lost the plot and his party abandoned him. His own party, Bersatu, abandoned him. And instead, they elected his deputy, Muhyiddin Yassin, to be the new prime minister. And that was in 2020. Muhyiddin's government basically projected itself as a very Malay-centric or Malay-first government, and it basically consists of three core Malay parties. UMNO, the party that he deposed in 2018, Bersatu, Mahathir X Party, and PAS, the Islamic Party. So they came in initially, they had lots of support in the Malay community, but because of the onset of the COVID crisis, they began to lose their plot and they began to lose support. But eventually this year, the government fell apart. And this is where the story becomes very complicated, but also very interesting. The government fell apart because the former Prime Minister, Najib Razak, the man who the world associates with 1MDB, he made a big comeback this year together with his successor, UMNO, a guy called Zahid Hamidi. They got together and pulled down Muhyiddin Yassin's government because Muhyiddin refused to do their bidding. So basically what happened was that after 2018, when Pakatan Harapan took over, they took a series of legal actions against Najib and several senior people UMNO who were involved in 1MDB plus other sort of corruption things in Malaysia. So because Muhyiddin Yassin refused to deal with this group, they decided to pull down the government. So now we're in a funny situation where Ismail Sabri from UMNO is now in charge of this new government, but he is also a very weak leader because their majority in parliament, as I understand it, is between 2 or 3. So what happened was that when he got into power in August this year, the first thing he did was that he made peace with Najib and Zahid. Muhyiddin Yassin refused to make peace with them. He made peace with them, so he has a full support UMNO. But more importantly, he reached across the aisles and did a MOU, a political MOU with the opposition to keep his government in power. So the easiest way of understanding the current administration, Ismail Sabri government, is one, it is still a very Malay-centric, Islamic-centric government. Secondly, it is basically a government of convenience. It's basically there until the next general election. And that's the reason why he's willing to sign an MOU with the opposition. Everybody's in a holding pattern and everyone's preparing for GE15. And the third and perhaps the most important point, and that is although everyone is preparing for GE15, the economy is getting worse and worse. And because of that, I suspect the elections will be held earlier rather than later. Officially, according to the rules of parliament, election doesn't have to be held until 2023, but I suspect elections will be held in 2022, the second half of next year. So that's basically a very brief summary from me.
a tremendous job. And you mentioned both the worsening economic situation, but you also briefly touched on COVID, and Muhyiddin's handling of the COVID-19 state of emergency is reported in the press as being one of the reasons why his prime ministership ended. So I'm wondering, how has the pandemic affected Malaysian politics and society?
Well, my argument is that the COVID thing, in fact, was a plus factor for Muhyiddin, because if you remember, when he came to power in March 2020, that was when the world was heading towards lockdown. So one of the things he did was immediately suspend parliament using COVID as the excuse. So in fact, COVID allowed him to do a lot of what Malaysians call monkey business, because the moment he shut down government, it means he was in full control of the administration. And we know that after they lifted the state of emergency, we know that he spent a lot of money on things that he should not be spending money. So for example, instead of spending money to prop up the economy, a lot of the money went into political projects. So that's the reason why I think the Malaysian economy is in big trouble now. A lot of people do not realize how serious the economy is. And I'll just give you an example. Although the official figure is that the economy contracted by about 10%, when I speak to my business friends in Malaysia, most of them tell me the figure is closer to a quarter. 25% of the economy has just disappeared. So if they don't revive the economy this year, I think we can expect real political tensions in the system coming next year.
And we might get back to some forecasting later on in the event. But Rita, let's sort of turn our attention to the past. As a historian, how can we place these political developments in a historical context? Are these consistent features of Malaysian politics?
Well, look, it's a great question, and I've thought about it actually, quite a lot lately, because, obviously watching the Pakatan Harapan government essentially collapse itself, due to the pressures that James outlined, the question has kind of come up, I suppose, because there was genuinely some enthusiasm. I mean, I don't want to overplay the enthusiasm when UMNO fell, when Barisan Nasional fell, because it was a partial kind of response, right? Like, it wasn't a whole of society, rejoicing or anything like that. But I think that's the key, right? So if we summarize James's summary, essentially, what we've got is a situation where all these alliances are shifting and changing because there is an effort on to attempt to regroup the Malay Muslim majority that has historically kept UMNO in power. Now, that majority is not a natural one. It doesn't just automatically exist. It's got to be created and recreated and constructed and reconstructed using various techniques and tactics of power, I guess. And so that's where, if we look at the past, we can actually see quite a consistent pattern. And it actually goes back to, the independence of Malaya, which we now refer to as Peninsular Malaysia, in 1957. So even after, the fuller Malaysia was formed in 1963, the Malayan pattern seems to have determined the direction of federal politics whenever there's a multiracial challenge. So essentially, there's the pattern is that there's a surge of multiracial politics built by individuals and organizations and members of the public who know that that is their path to reform. So that's the way they're going to organize, and that's the way they're going to try and push for change. And when I say multiracial, what I mean by that is that members of all of Malaysia's so-called races participate in politics on the basis of a kind of a shared civic nationalism or a public citizenship. Now, usually what happens is that surge starts to become threatening to established political elites, usually because it gains the capacity to split that carefully cultivated Malay Muslim majority. So when it does that, it starts to become, seriously threatening to established elites. And generally what happens is it's beaten back by a process of racial and religious mobilization that uses whatever means it has at its disposal to derail the multiracial push. And that's where the forces in Parliament kind of are right now. Like, they're trying to find a way to just hold on and get ready for that push to come at the next election or some other means. And so very often that beating back tends to take place under the cover that's created by calling an emergency, just as the state did last year, just as it did for 2 years after the 1969 election, which is another example, and the racial pogrom that followed, and just as it did for 12 years from 1948 to 1960, just as Malaysia, the nation, or Malaya, the independent colony, was being designed. And so usually what happens is that push tends to portray multiracialism as an attempt by Malaysia's racial minorities, usually Chinese, to usurp Malay Muslims' purportedly rightful place as Malaysia's supreme race. And so the argument goes, the fact that that majority can be split at all means that it has to be pulled back together again by any means necessary, so that its internal divisions are papered over, and those internal divisions are serious and evident and in part structured by the economic collapse that we've witnessed in Malaysia. I think the politics of precarity and unemployment and falling incomes and all those things I think are going to be actually very important. But the attempt, of course, is to kind of paper over those divisions and use race as the key wedge. And so usually what happens is a period in which racial and religious identity becomes really salient, because that's the way, the forces that are threatened are going to put their majority back together again. So, I've got an article coming out on the 1948 to 60 emergency in a history journal called Itinerario. It's coming out later this month. And there I look at that process of, a surge of multiracial politics. And in fact, in that case, it was quite a violent pushback. It was, a full-scale war that they called an emergency. Subsequent emergencies have not used anywhere near as much violence. In 1969, one pogrom was enough. This time around, there hasn't been a need for any violence. There have been other means at the state's disposal. But ultimately, what's happened in each case is a new kind of racial mobilization, a new rewriting of the kind of the racial contract, right? Which Malay nationalists love to refer to. They call it the social contract. They don't call it the racial contract. But that is, in fact, how Malaysian society is organized, as a group of races that the British constructed and left behind for us. And then we've all got to carry those racial labels around and live with those things, until the end of time by the look of it. And so politically, that's very useful, right? So that's the pattern.
Yeah, so you kind of preempted my next question here, because I am really interested in the role of identity, particularly Islam, in contemporary Malaysian political system. It seems from what you're saying that it really is one of the central features in understanding Malaysian politics. You really need to understand how race and how religion works within that society. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure I can. And I, I've got to say that sometimes, discussions about race can lead to a certain squeamishness. When we look at Malaysian society, we have to kind of get over that and accept that indeed this is the way society is structured. And it's something that is constantly reinforced in part through the use of religiosity, right? So I guess before I go on, I should probably, just make it really clear that I'm not talking about personal piety or belief, but rather the way that identity and religion are deployed and mobilized in the context of the political system. And as I said before, the reason it's so kind of salient, the reason it's so easy to turn into a really useful wedging device is because of the need to continually shore up that Malay Muslim majority. And so the fact that Muslims, Malays are by definition in the federal constitution Muslim, means that other Muslims who aren't Malays aren't important. Ultimately, the usefulness of religion is that it happens to overlap almost squarely with the category Malay. So the racial and the religious, they allow a certain kind of slipperiness, a certain slippage. The state uses that slippage to kind of have more resources at its disposal to keep on shoring up that majority. So basically, religion is a rich resource that the state can mine, I guess, to help ensure that that majority keeps on cohering around a central pole of attraction. And that's not actually that easy. There are lots of other influences in society, lots of other opportunities for people to look in other directions. As we have both mentioned, that Malay majority is actually internally, it's quite differentiated. There are differences of class, there are differences of kind of lifestyle, of interest, of exposure to other influences. Everybody is, of course, exposed to all sorts of global influences, but what's attractive is not always the same a lot of things. So, you have some people looking to the Muslim world, you have some people looking to, attractive things from the West, and there's quite a soft power contest in terms of where people's attention is, but the state will always make sure that it is to some extent focused on Islam and the need to cohere together. And I'll give you a really good recent example of how that sort of thing is done. It's done using the classic tools of the culture war, right? So, there are examples from all around the world of governments effectively using culture to wedge the population. And there's been this example just recently of this whiskey bottle. I don't know if you followed this, Beck, but certainly I'm sure the others on the panel have. But essentially, there's a brand of whiskey. It's called Thima. It's made in Malaysia. There are some doubts as to whether it's actually whiskey or not because of how it's made, but I don't actually know the technical details. The main thing is the name and the label. It's called timah, which is the Malay word for tin. And now, of course, the reason, the Malay states were such attractive colonies to Western powers in the first place is because they had all these raw materials, including tin. So it's kind of like a throwback to, that legacy. So it's got a guy with a beard on the label, and it's called timah. And this has been seized upon by, God knows who, cyber troopers on the internet, as an example of nefarious alcohol dealers trying to draw Muslims into consuming alcohol. Because timah could be read, if you were particularly obtuse, as a shortening of the name of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima, if you wanted to. You probably wouldn't, but you could if you wanted to. And the guy with the beard, well, he could be a Muslim, he's got a beard. He's actually a British colonial official. And so, this thing has been kind of chewed up and, turned into fodder in the media as a way to problematize and make into a controversy the fact that there's alcohol produced and sold to non-Muslims and tourists and whatever in Malaysia. And so that's been through the ringer in the media. In the end, the whiskey brand seems to have won the culture war. It's not going to change its name. But this is how, attention is kind of drawn to questions of, who is actually threatening you? Is it non-Muslims threatening you? Is it Chinese, etc.? So, this goes on just on and on and on with example after example. And it's just a constant process of making sure that people's attention is constantly focused towards who its threat is. And its threat must be internal, it must be minorities. And that's how it works.
Fascinating. I wasn't expecting to be discussing culture wars over whiskey. So I've learned definitely learned something new tonight. But Kirsten, I might take the conversation over to you with a deceptively straightforward question. Is Malaysia a democracy?
Well, thanks a lot, Beck, for this question. I have to say, when I got this question, I thought, that is seriously a hot potato that she's thrown to me, and I'm not sure whether this can be entangled in the allocated time. So I do my best. So please bear with me for a moment. So if there are numerous definitions of what a democracy is, I'm not going into this. We are sticking to the most basic one, which is saying a form of government in which people choose their leaders by voting. And as James summarized beforehand, well, Malaysia does choose their leaders by voting, not in the past 3 years, but before it. So the 2018 election was a clear sign that, yes, governments who have been in power for a very long time can be kicked out of power. However, if you're looking at numerous surveys, and the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index is one, and it classifies Malaysia as a flawed democracy. The Freedom House, which is coming out of the US, is also saying Malaysia is partly free as a democracy. And this is really where we are getting into the challenge of the democracy, the simple definition. Because if we're looking at 3 key areas, so we might look first at the election. Do we have free and fair elections with possibility of regime change? As history has shown us, yes, we do. We do have, of course, challenges in the electoral system, and I'm not glossing them over, but unlike Singapore, we did have a change in regime. The second one is the freedom and protection of civil liberties, and this is a really challenging issue, particularly in a multiracial country, as Amrita explained to us, because what you have to look at is the main influence, and Amrita did a fantastic job of pulling Islam out of this. And a lot of those challenges are coming out of the relationship between the state and Islam. Is it an Islamic state? Is it not an Islamic state? And in the question of human rights, we have the classic problems there of Islam and challenges of reconciling them with certain human rights, such as family law, gender equality, LGBT rights, freedom of religion, criminal laws, etc. The list goes on and on. We also have issues in Malaysia in regards to freedom of the media and reporting. We have issues in regards to human trafficking, where the US has just downgraded Malaysia to the worst tier in its annual report. And we do have issues of police corruption and excessive use of force and the complaints mechanism. So we've got a fair number of human rights issues that show that this democracy does have indeed some issues. We also have the issue of the rule of law, and in particularly an independent judiciary that protects these freedoms and holds governments and officials accountable. And while we have seen improvements there, and I'm delighted to a certain degree with the decisions being handed down by the higher courts this year, we've got the courts being extremely courageous, passing down decisions in contested religious and political matters, particularly this year. So please do me a favor, ask me about this if you want to see me seriously excited. We also have the question of whether we can detangle the executive and the judiciary. And James flagged that. So one of the reasons why we had the change in government was because of the 1MDB scandal. And what the 1MDB scandal showed us was that we had such a tangled up mess of executive, politics, economics, and judiciary that internal investigations weren't going anywhere. With the change in power due to the election, that mess got slightly detangled. It still has its problem, but it got slightly detangled. So there are positive signs for democracy, but the question is, are we staying on this trajectory, or are we diverting again? And that is something that is really hard to say.
Yeah, there seems to be this kind of awkward trend of, 61 years of no change in government, and now there's like a lot of change going on. And is there a kind of happy medium, and is that necessary, I guess, for democracy? But I did want to ask you, Kirsten, about about corruption and the role that plays in Malaysian politics. The 1MDB has been a sprawling saga, I think, that many of us are familiar with. But you kind of touched on it in your response. But how is this affecting rule of law? And then what kind of consequences does that have for democracy?
Mm-hmm. I think it is, again, a really good question. For me, it is, what role is corruption playing in Malaysian politics, or what role is politics playing in cases of corruption? So I think I would slightly reorder this, because I think the 1MDB scandal really illustrates this point for us. We can now divide it into two phases, let's put it this way: the pre-election phase and the post-election phase, if you want to, and what's happening next with the third phase coming up, because as James mentioned, Najib might make a comeback. So in the pre-election phase, it was clear that corruption cases are not going to be investigated if there is no political will. While the rest of the world was heavily investigating issues with 1MDB and its investments, Malaysia put up a firewall around 1MDB, and national investigations weren't moving a bit. Now, following the election, and 1MDB was indeed an issue during the election campaigns. I'm not arguing that it was the main contributor to have this change in regime, but it did contribute to the regime change. Following this, we saw clear signs that things are moving along. Najib was quickly charged and in 2020 found guilty of 1 count of abuse of power, 3 counts of criminal breach of trust, 3 counts of money laundering, etc. Now, currently, the sentence is being appealed by both sides, and the hearing has just been postponed. So wait for it. the interesting part with the on hold pattern is now a statement by the Prime Minister in August, where he basically said that he received pressure from particular parties to intervene in court matters as a way to exonerate several unnamed individuals from criminal charges. That was in August, while the appeal decision to stay proceedings, etc., was handed down in late July. So there is a fair bit of time linkage that we could construct, even though he never named names, that we could construct to that degree. If that's the case, well, it is interesting because it shows that the culture really hasn't changed. If we are still believing that the executive, that it is appropriate by political officials to put pressure on these types of investigations and proceedings in front of the courts. Other positive signs is the inclusion of corporate corruption in the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission Act, which is mostly needed, but it didn't address, and these amendments really fell short when it came to government-linked companies, GLCs. And while they are now liable for punishment if their employees are associated in crimes of corruption, it is still a problem of selective enforcement and prosecution when it comes to these part of governments. So going with corruption, right track? Probably. Are we going well because of the changes, despite of the changes, or regardless of the changes? These are our three options. And I am not sure whether I can make a judgment call on this yet, to be quite honest. Thank you so much.
Very interesting. I did want to, before I take the conversation back to James, just say, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. I see that we have one in there. I've got a couple more to pose to our panelists. It would be great to see some more questions in the Q&A box. But James, you mentioned that there's somewhat of a holding pattern at the moment, and you mentioned that a prediction that elections will may be held in the second half of next year. So I wanted to ask you about your views, having heard the other panelists talk about various issues related to Malaysia's democracy. What are your views on Malaysia's long-term democratic prospects?
So my view is probably not the popular view. My view is that everything depends on two issues. The first is something that Amitra has raised, which is the issue of political Islam. Political Islam will have a major impact on which direction Malaysia will take. The second thing I'd like to remind your viewers is that if there's going to be any political change, any forms of reforms, it has to come from the Malay establishment itself. I have to use my word very carefully. I'm not talking about the Malay population or the Malay polity. I'm talking about the Malay establishment. The Malay establishment is a very unique creature in the Malaysian context. In some ways, it's very similar to the Thai establishment because there's also an element of royalty influence in that establishment as well. So it has to come from either political Islam or the rise of political Islam or the Malay establishment itself. My take is that the next election, the next general election is crucial in that it will signal which way Malaysia will be going. So the best way to describe what is happening now, besides the holding pattern now, is that you have to understand in the Malaysian context, one of the reasons why Barisan Nasional was such a stable coalition, and everybody, looked past its problem with racial politics, religious politics. The rest of the world just ignored Malaysia for a very long time, despite the fact that you had lots of institutional problems in Malaysia, including institutional racism. Everyone, in fact, said Malaysia was a great country, was a good model for a multiracial population. One of the reasons why Barisan Nasional was such a stable form of government was because you only had one core Malay party in the coalition, the ruling coalition, but you can have multiple parties representing anybody under the sun. So at the height of Barisan Nasional, you had one core Malay party, UMNO, but you had 13 other political parties representing the Chinese, the tribal groups, anything you want, not a problem. But the core party is UMNO. Now, what has happened since 2018 is that this model is completely broken because now you have two core Malay parties, right? Bersatu, which was set up by Mahathir, then Dam Mahathir, and UMNO. Both of them are trying to compete each other. So there's an old Chinese saying that for a small mountain, you can only afford to keep one tiger. So the question is that which tiger is going to run Malaysia? Because obviously you can't have two strong core Malay parties in the same government. And that's exactly what you're seeing now. You got Bersatu on the one hand and UMNO on the other hand, both trying very hard to control the federal government. And that's the reason why at the state level, with the upcoming Malacca elections, they're fighting each other to see who can, who has the upper hand in terms of the Malay votes. Now, in the next general election, if there is a clear winner among the Malay votes, I'm not talking about non-Malay votes, among the Malay votes, right? If UMNO comes out very clearly the winner, or the Bersatu comes out very clearly the winner, then we will be slowly moving back to this sort of Barisan Nasional type of system, where inside the coalition, one core Malay parties and multiple other parties representing all sorts of groups. So if you can get that sort of results, we'll probably have a stable system moving forward. Now, in the next election, if we have a split in the Malay vote like what we saw in 2018, then unfortunately, we will see another period of political instability. And the most important political force during a period of instability will be political Islam.
And Marita, I'm going to ask pose the same question to you. Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about long-term democratic prospects? Or maybe there's a question about whether such a concept is even sort of appropriate for the kind of political system that we're talking about here.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's a couple of parts to the answer. I mean, I suppose, I hesitate to make predictions because I have to work historically, right? But at the same time, it is possible to see what the parties are trying to do. I mean, they are, as James mentioned, trying to organize things and regroup so that there is only one tiger on the Malay mountain. And the reason they have to do that is usually after multiracial alternatives are pushed back. There's a process of rewriting the rules, as I mentioned, rewriting the racial settlement. And then what usually happens after that is a kind of, it settles down. So essentially, after provoking the racial wedge and the shoring up of the majority and the marginalizing of the minority, things settle down in the form of, I guess, a consociational agreement. And what I mean by that is, the various races that exist in Malaysia, their elites essentially bash out another settlement and they figure out another way of operating, and generally they form something like the Barisan Nasional, which means, of course, the National Front of Malaysia's races, which is, essentially what that is referring to. So if that is possible this time around, then I guess it will stabilize. Will it be more democratic? Well, I mean, the functions of a democracy will still exist. The trappings of a democracy will still exist. There will still be people voting, as Kirsten pointed out. And I think the fact that the Malaysian elite wants Malaysia to be viewed as a democracy, it wants those trappings, it wants those institutions. I think that want is in itself a constraint against just dumping them in order to kind of create a new settlement or an Islamic state or whatever it might be. And that will probably provoke them to try and do what Mahathir did for all those years in his last experience as Prime Minister, which was essentially keep those Islamists on the margin while telling non-Malays and non-Muslims, I will protect you from them. So vote for me always, never vote for anybody else, and I will protect you from them. And to Malays, I will make you rich, riding the wave of economic growth via the new economic policy. And so he was kind of able to use economic growth and his kind of stable position as the leader of that National Front. He was able to kind of use it to dish out a little bit to everyone. And even though society was being restructured in the background, everyone was still getting a bit. Now with the economy the way it is, I don't know if that's actually possible to organize. And I don't know if Malaysia will follow that historical Malaysia pattern that I pointed to before, or whether something new will happen. entirely. But I can see what they're trying to do. They are trying to go back to something resembling a Barisan Nasional. It will have a new name, it will have new characters, they'll all have fought with each other, they'll all make up, factions will split and factions will realign, and that'll all go on. And that's where the complicated, the annoying kind of complicatedness of it comes from. But ultimately, what's underlying all of that is yes, they are looking for a way to go back to a stable settlement, and they haven't found it. So that's where the unpredictability comes in, right?
Absolutely. Kirsten, I'll bring you into the conversation here. What are your thoughts on the future?
I agree with both James and Amrita on this, and I might have another factor of unpredictability that we haven't touched upon, and that is that we potentially have 7.8 million new voters in the next election, because Malaysia had on the books to lower the age of the voting age from 21 to 18. And the government had tried to postpone this and push it away. So what we saw then was young potential voters going on the street, a lot of protests on this one. And now, in fact, we do have the court is ordering the government to be implementing those changes by December 31st of December this year. So for the new election, we will have those voters, and those voters that are politically active and that are protesting are usually crossing those political borderlines and issues. They are a different type of voters than we've seen beforehand. So it's going to be really interesting to see whether they will be able to influence the upcoming elections and where their votes will fall, because they do not have those traditional alliances that we had to other youth organizations by political parties, etc. A whole lot of them are not organized along those lines.
Fascinating. Thank you. I can see we have a few more questions in the Q&A box. So James, I might direct the first one to you. It's very, very straightforward question. What's happened to Anwar and why? Did you want to take this question?
So what happened to Anwar? So Anwar got played. He got played by Mahathir. He got played by part of the Malay establishment. So when Mahathir refused to hand over power to Anwar, Anwar basically tried to regroup and try to make a claim on the prime ministership. But I think for the last 2 years, he has lost a lot of credibility, because in the last 3 years, he has said on 3 major occasions, including holding press conferences, saying that he had the numbers to form a new government. And each time it was found that he did not have the numbers to form a new government. It is also widely expected, well, this is what I've been told in Malaysian political circles, that if he were to lead the opposition into the next general election, GE15, this will be his last chance to be the Prime Minister of Malaysia. But it is my prediction that he will never be Prime Minister, because if he were to lead the coalition into the next general election, my take at the present moment is that Pakatan Harapan will lose if he's the leader of Pakatan Harapan.
Thank you. The next question is to you, Amrita. There is a question about the use of the term pogrom, which is associated with a particular set of circumstances. So there's a question here about the evidence around an organised massacre of an ethnic group in 1969 and who organised it. So I think this is a good opportunity to sort of dig back into history here and tell us that story.
Well, it's a massively disputed question. So essentially, who organised it? Well, there are 2 versions of the story. It's sensitive and disputed. Essentially, the official version of the story is that after essentially the DAP, now in headlights again as having split the Malay majority in 2018 as well. But essentially, the minority parties managed to surge in a multiracial kind of victory to deny the then alliance its 2/3 majority in parliament. So the alliance is the predecessor of the National Front. It's a similar idea, the 3 races get together and its elites form a front. So that was the last time a kind of a really dominant parliamentary majority was challenged. And so the story goes that there were marches through the streets, and there was too much exuberant celebration. And as a result, there was a violent backlash against Chinese people in Kuala Lumpur. There is also another version out there which is disputed, and it's kind of it hasn't really had a lot of attention, and I imagine that's because it's sensitive, which is that actually the whole thing was orchestrated as a kind of a response to that surge of multiracial politics and to that electoral denial of the supermajority by people who were affiliated with the ruling party. I don't know if that's true. I haven't looked at it. I haven't tested it. But I can say that these versions are kind of floating around out there, and they are highly, highly sensitive. It is true that after that round of violence, whether we call it a pogrom or not, you can call it a race riot. That's usually how it's referred to. It's a bit less sensitive. If you call it a riot, it makes it sound more spontaneous. And like I say, it's disputed. But there is certainly the reality that after that, an emergency was called. A national consultative council was formed of elites and their sort of government state appointees. Meetings were held of the various races. A new settlement was thrashed out, and a new settlement was delivered in the form of the new economic policy. So, how we talk about it is going to be a complicated issue. I can't resolve it in my answer to this question, but it does point to a certain kind of pattern of a surge of new politics. It was new at the time, and then a kind of a backlash and a new settlement. So that's my answer.
Thank you. The next question I will direct to you, Kirsten. It's given what you know about other regimes around the world, will the schism between Malay voter communities reach an uncomfortable boiling point? So again, we get back to that question, tensions between different political communities and what that might mean for stability.
Mm-hmm. And I think the next question actually is putting it to the boiling point itself, isn't it? When it is asked, should non-Malays who work hard and taxpayers get out of the country? I would hope not. It is an uncomfortable situation when you do have these tensions coming head, and when the pendulum is swinging from one side to another. But when it comes to political Islam, for instance, and this would be the boiling point, as James probably also hinted at, if we have the pendulum swinging towards the political Islam, we might see more of an issue there. But so far, Malaysia has avoided going what I would call too far to the extreme. And the recent, also the court decisions, which I alluded to, are giving me a bit of comfort in this, because when we have this pendulum swinging, it's also how the judiciary is recalibrating it. And the question becomes, what's higher, the constitution or Islamic law? And that has been a tension within the judiciary quite often. And I'm taking quite hard that the judiciary right now, as I see it with its decision, is swinging towards the end of constitutional rights, and the constitution is the founding part of it, and Islamic law is taking to a degree a subservient role towards it, and that for me shows that we will have protection of the non-Malays, which at some point in time was not so clear when it came to their rights and their civil liberties, of whether they will be protected or not. Based on the current jurisprudence as I see coming out of the courts are saying it very serious, and it is clear constitution above everything else.
I might stick with you for the minute, because we're talking about the constitution, but an element of Malaysian politics is that it is a constitutional monarchy. So I'm wondering, what role has the monarch or the royal family been playing in Malaysian politics of late?
Oh, it's a good one, because what we also have, it is a constitutional monarchy, but it is unlike any other constitutional monarchy in the sense that it is a rotating constitutional monarchy, right? We do not have one royal family as such. We do have the different royal families of the states, and the monarch is coming then out of the different states. The monarch, of course, has an important role to play, and has been playing an important role when it came to political stability, and also trying to negotiate or navigate the different political lines. Some of them were much better in doing this than others, no doubt about this, and there have always been issues in regards to how much political power should they be exercising compared to should they be much more of a ceremonial role, etc. So it is a very, very tricky one.
James, there is the question here, and I'm glad that it is in here, because I was actually wanting to ask something a little bit similar, is that of course there is an international context for the things that are happening in Malaysia, in particular when it comes to global democracy. You know, there's a rise of populism, there's you know, a decline in democracy across the region, you know, for the last 15, 16 years that's being tracked. So I'm wondering whether there's a relationship between the kind of international context and what we see in Malaysia's domestic politics. But the question here is also about Asia-Pacific international relations, and whether there is also an effect on bilateral relationships, so particularly between Australia and Malaysia relations. So I know I've given you a little bit there to discuss.
Thank you very much. So Australia's relationship with Malaysia will not change for the foreseeable future. Australia's relationship with Malaysia has always been stable. And part of the reason why it's been stable is because I think there's a lot of people-to-people contacts between Malaysia and Australia. As you know, for many, many years, Malaysian students have been coming to Australia to study. The first big group came during the Colombo Plan years. They went back to Malaysia. A lot of them are holding senior positions, so they always had a very positive view of Australia. So on top of that, Malaysia and Australia also share the same British heritage, and that led to a thing called Five Powers Defence Pact. So the Australian troops has always been in Malaysia, especially in Penang, since Malaysia's independence. So there's always been these very deep links between Malaysia and Australia. These links are independent of whoever is in government. So I don't expect things to be rocky between Malaysia and Australia. In recent years, I think, especially under the previous High Commissioner, in fact, the relationship moved to what they call comprehensive strategic relationship. So in fact, it is sort of on track, moving up every few years. So relationship is very, very stable. I don't expect any major upheavals, you know, for the foreseeable future. The second question you were asking was about? Oh, the regional stuff.
The more international context around democracy.
Yeah, sorry. Where does Malaysia sit in all of this? I think for a very long time, not only the general public, but also scholars have always put Malaysia and Singapore together. These are two sort of a single party, soft authoritarian states where, you know, we know that who's going to win the elections all the time, even though that, I mean, the best way to describe it is that these are really hybrid states. They have elements of democratic norms about them, but they also have a lot of elements of authoritarian rule as well. Malaysia sort of broke that model in 2018, but we sort of, you know, a lot of us think that it's actually making a comeback now. There's a correction being held. So everyone is looking towards Singapore, and the questions being asked is that, you know, in the next few general elections in Singapore, will the Singaporeans do the Malaysian thing, like what happened in 2018, throw the PAP out and see what happens? So this is where I think the international thing in terms of Malaysia, Singapore, people are looking at Malaysia, Singapore more closely now, because these are very unusual hybrid states. At one time, people thought that it's a model. And even today, if you go to China, a lot of the Chinese senior people are saying that Singapore is a potential model for the next transformation of the Chinese Communist Party. you can grant people complete economic freedom, and you grant them or make them think they have, political freedom, when in fact everything is controlled from behind the scenes. So that's where Malaysia is now. But generally speaking, my impression speaking to people around the world is that the 1MDB thing has really damaged Malaysia's credibility around the world, especially among the financial community. And I think it will take many, many years for Malaysia to recover its credibility if it doesn't undertake fundamental reforms to the economy and key institutions. I think what we're looking for, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of my two other panelists, that one of the things in Malaysia is to become more democratic. You really need core institutional reforms, not only in the judiciary, but in the civil service and all the other key institutions. Because what happened was, after the long period of Barisan Nasional rule, they have corrupted all the institutions of the state. And if you do not, if you do not reform these institutions, I think it doesn't matter if the people go to the street, even if they want to demand for more democracy, if the institutions can't react to the demands of the people, we will be back to square one.
Yeah, very important point. Although I would add that when talking about sort of political upheaval and thinking about Australia and Malaysia's relationship, of course, Australia is not is quite used to its own revolving door of political leadership as well. But Rita, I might ask the next. It's not quite a question that's been put in here, but there is a statement here around the historic and current views of the ethnic Chinese minority in Malaysia, and I'm wondering whether you have a comment to make about that.
I guess so. I mean, like the other question, I guess what I'll do is I'll try and frame it in terms of the debate. So, I don't really know if I'm being asked about views that ethnic Chinese hold or views that are held about ethnic Chinese. So let's do it this way. Essentially, there's in Malaysian and Malayan and Malay politics have required a Chinese threat since at least the 1920s. They revolve around a Chinese threat. That Chinese threat is usually internal to society, in the sense that, there are Chinese Malayans and now Chinese Malaysians living inside that society. They're the largest minority. And despite during the emergency, more than 20,000 of them being deported back to China, and, lots of them being rounded up and put into these things called new villages that were basically re-education camps, there's been quite an experience there, right, with the ethnic Chinese minority, and that experience has revolved around it being cast as a threat to racial supremacy, Malay racial supremacy. And every time it is cast that way, well, that's just basically a very effective thing to do, because, as I mentioned before, it's all part of that dynamics of making sure that Malay Muslim majority is permanently able to view itself that way, able to identify with itself and with the salience of those two identity categories, and it, frankly, is permanently mobilized. And so if it's mobilized to vote a certain way, if it's mobilized to act a certain way, then it can be called upon to do so, preferably in the service, especially of maintaining the power of whoever ends up being the one Malay party, if that's even possible anymore. So that's the way the Chinese minority and the kind of the presence of the Chinese minority has functioned politically for a very long time. And I'll just point to the really interesting thing that Pakatan Harapan did when it won the 2018 election, because aside from all the other things it did that were interesting and kind of historic and actually allowed for the first time for a government to fall, one really important thing they did was they externalized the Chinese threat. So essentially what they said to Malay Muslim voters is, okay, if you need a Chinese threat, we're going to give you one. And this time it isn't going to be your Chinese neighbors and workmates and, kids down the street. It's going to be the People's Republic of China, which right now is the biggest threat, out there in terms of, the way China is cast and the kind of the international and domestic politics around China. So what they were able to do was connect the story of Najib and the 1MDB corruption with the story of the China threat. So essentially they were able to say, stop blaming the DAP, look at Najib, he's taken all this money out of the budget, and now he's bringing in all these Chinese Belt and Road projects, and he's selling the nation to China. So you want a Chinese threat? He's the Chinese threat. And that worked. It kind of authorized people who are concerned about sovereignty and concerned about the security of the nation to vote against UMNO for the first time in their lives. So the effectiveness of that move, I think, is one that's it's just been such an artful move. I don't know if it can be repeated. I mean, the threat has now been re-internalized, and that's the normal pattern. So, you know, things can happen once, they can happen again. You know, there are creative ways that people can, I don't know, come up with competitive election campaigns, come up with competitive ways to push back. I don't know if they'll work again, though.
Now we are on 6 p.m, but I would like to sneak in one more question that that's been sitting in the Q&A box, and I'll direct it to Kirsten, because you mentioned that there's going to be, you know, new voters voting for the first time. But there's a question here about the massive brain drain that's taking place. Every Chinese Malaysian who can afford it is getting educated overseas and staying there after graduation, and that this perhaps may not bode well for the future of Malaysia. Did you have any thoughts on that particular question?
I think it's a brilliant question, and if we weren't in a global pandemic where it wouldn't be that easy to be an international student, I would say this is clearly the case. So for me, one of the issues is how is COVID going to be impacting those things, because a lot of the Chinese Malaysian students were coming to Australia, and we haven't had international students on our shores for quite some time. Whether the ones that are here now can extend their visas and stay is another really tricky problem that Australia is at the moment grappling with, but that's a side issue. From a perspective, yes, there's always the risk that if the pendulum is swinging too far, that you will lose good people, because they will avail themselves to the opportunities to go overseas, get an education, and stay there. I'm a best example of that, even though I didn't leave because the pendulum was swinging into any ways. So brain drains are a real issue. And it is a matter then for the government also to see whether their previous policies of getting the non-Malays voters into their camps, and this is what the previous coalition did, right? They weren't only in power because of the Malay voters. They also had voters from within the minorities, and indeed some of the minorities parties were in the ruling coalition as well. So it becomes a question on how are they going to be positioning themselves towards these minorities voters and able to mobilize them to vote for them.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I would like to thank our panelists, James, Amrita and Kirsten, for a really rich and fascinating discussion. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's just really terrific to be able to unpack the very complicated trends and shifts in political allegiances with you. So thank you, and thank you as always to our audience for tuning in and for asking such excellent questions. Our next scheduled La Trobe Asia webinar is Surviving COVID-19 and a Military Coup as a Garment Worker, and that is next Tuesday as part of the Women in Asia conference. Kirsten is co-organising that conference, and we at La Trobe Asia are really delighted to be able to support that. So that public event will be taking place on Tuesday, the 23rd of November at 5:30 p.m. AEDT. In the meantime, please follow us on Twitter at La Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find out more details for online events and La Trobe Asia publications. But thank you again.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you so much for hosting.
Thank you
so much.